Chapter 12. The Working Period. Let us take two lines of business, each with the same working day, say a labor process of 10 hours, for example cotton spinning and the manufacture of locomotives. In one case, a definite quantity of the finished product, cotton yarn, is turned out every day and every week. In the other, the labor process must be repeated for perhaps 3 months in order to produce a finished product, one locomotive. In the one case, the product is discrete in nature, and the same work begins afresh each day or each week. In the other case, the labor process is continuous and stretches over a large number of daily labor processes, which supply a finished product only after a protracted interval through the connectedness and continuity of their operations. Even though the duration of the daily labor process is the same in both cases, there's a very significant difference in the duration of the act of production, i.e., in the duration of the repeated labor processes that are required in order to turn out the product in its finished form, to send it onto the market as a commodity, and thus to transform it from productive capital into commodity capital. The distinction between fixed and circulating capital has nothing to do with this. The distinction made here would obtain even if exactly the same proportion of fixed and circulating capital were applied in the two lines of business. These differences in the duration of the act of production do not just occur between different branches of production but also within the same branch according to the size of the product to be supplied. An ordinary dwelling house is built in a shorter time than a large factory and hence requires a smaller number of continuous labor processes. If the building of a locomotive takes 3 months, that of a battleship takes a year if not several. The production of grain demands almost a year, that of horned cattle several years, while it can take anything from 12 to 100 years to raise timber. A road can be built in a few months, while a railway requires years, an ordinary carpet perhaps 1 week, while a gobelin takes years, etc. The differences in length of the act of production are thus of infinite variety. The differing duration of the act of production must obviously produce a difference in the speed of turnover where capital outlays of equal size are involved, i.e. in the periods of time for which a given capital is advanced. Let us assume that the spinning mill and the locomotive works apply equal capitals, with the same division between constant and variable, and between the fixed and fluid components of capital. Finally, that the working day is equally long, and there is the same division between necessary and surplus labor. So as to set aside too all circumstances arising from the circulation process and external to the present case, we shall assume that both yarn and locomotive are produced to order and paid for on delivery of the finished product. At the end of the week, when the finished yarn is delivered, the spinner receives back his outlay of circulating capital, as well as the wear and tear of the fixed capital contained in the value of the yarn. We ignore the surplus value. He can now repeat the same circuit again with the same capital. He has completed his turnover. The locomotive manufacturer, on the other hand, must lay out fresh capital on wages and raw material week after week for 3 months. And only after 3 months, when the locomotive is delivered, does the circulating capital laid out bit by bit during this time for one and the same act of production to produce one and the same commodity exist again in a form in which it can begin its circuit once more. The wear and tear of the machinery during these 3 months is also replaced only now. One business has an outlay for 1 week, the other the same weekly outlay multiplied by 12. All other circumstances being assumed equal, the one must have 12 times as much circulating capital at its disposal as the other. The fact that the capitals advanced each week are equal, however, is a matter of indifference here. Whatever may be the size of the capital advanced, in the one case it is advanced only for 1 week, in the other for 12, before it can be used for a new operation, before the same operation can be repeated with it or one of a different kind begun. The difference in the speed of turnover, or the length of time for which the individual capital must be advanced before the same capital value can serve again for a new labor or valorization process, arises here from the following circumstances. Let us assume that the building of the locomotive, or any other machine, takes 100 working days. As far as the workers occupied in machine building are concerned, just as in spinning, the 100 working days form a discontinuous, discrete quantity. According to our assumption, they consist of 100 successive and separate 10-hour labor processes. But in relation to the product, the machine, the 100 working days form a continuous quantity, a working day of 1,000 working hours, a single related act of production. A working day of this kind, which is formed by the succession of more or less numerous interrelated working days, I call a working period. If we speak of the working day, then we mean the length of time for which the worker must daily expend his labor power, must work. If we speak of the working period, on the other hand, this means the number of interrelated working days that are required, in a particular line of business, to complete a finished product. The product of each working day is here only a partial product, which is taken a step further day by day and receives its finished shape, is a finished use value only at the close of a longer or shorter period of working time. Interruptions and disturbances of the social production process, as a result of crises, for example, thus have a very different effect on those products of labor that are discrete in nature and those whose production requires a longer connected period. In the former case, one day's production of a particular quantity of yarn, coal, etc. is simply not followed the next day by a fresh production of yarn or coal. It is otherwise with ships, buildings, railways, etc. Here, it is not only work that is interrupted, but an interconnected act of production. If the job is not carried any further, then the means of production and the labor already consumed in its production have been spent to no avail. Even if it is taken up again, deterioration will always have taken place in the meantime. The portion of value that the fixed capital surrenders every day to the product, until the latter is ready, builds up in layers throughout the whole duration of the working period. Here, we can also see the practical importance of the distinction between fixed and circulating capital. The fixed capital is advanced to the production process for a longer period of time. It does not need to be renewed until an interval of perhaps several years has elapsed. The fact that a steam engine gives up some value bit by bit each day to the yarn, the product of a discrete labor process, while it gives up value over 3 months to a locomotive, the product of a continuous act of production, in no way alters the outlay of capital needed to acquire the steam engine. In the one case, its value flows back in small doses, for example weekly, in the other case in large amounts, for example every 3 months. But in both cases, the steam engine is renewed only after some 20 years, say. As long as the individual period in which its value flows back bit by bit with the sale of the product is always shorter than its own period of existence, the same steam engine continues to function in the production process for several working periods. It is otherwise with the circulating components of the capital advanced. The labor power bought for this week is used up during the week and has objectified itself in the product. It must be paid for at the end of the week. And this capital outlay on labor power is repeated weekly over the 3 months, although the expenditure of this portion of capital in the 1 week does not enable the capitalist to cover the acquisition of labor in the next week. New, additional capital must be spent each week in payment for labor power, and if we set aside all credit relations, the capitalist must be able to lay out wages for the whole period of 3 months, even though he pays them only in weekly doses. It is the same with the other part of circulating capital, the raw materials and ancillaries. One layer of labor after the other is deposited on the product. It is not only the value spent on labor power that is steadily transferred to the product during the labor process, but also surplus value. However, all this is transferred to an unfinished product that does not yet have the shape of a finished commodity and is thus not capable of circulation. The same applies to the capital value transferred to the product layer upon layer in raw materials and ancillaries. According to the longer or shorter duration of the working period that the specific nature of the product or the useful effect to be attained demands for its production, a steadily additional expenditure of circulating capital is required: wages, raw materials, and ancillaries, no part of which exists in a form capable of circulation, such that it could serve to repeat the same operation. Each part is rather successively tied up within the production sphere as a component of the developing product, tied up in the form of productive capital. The turnover time of capital, however, is the sum of its production time and its circulation time. A lengthening of the production time thus reduces the speed of turnover as much as the lengthening of the circulation time. In the present case, however, there are 2 points to be noted. Firstly, the lengthened stay in the production sphere. The capital advanced in the first week, on labor, raw materials, etc., for instance, as well as the portions of value given up by the fixed capital to the product, remains confined to the production sphere for the entire term of 3 months. And as it is incorporated only into a product in formation, as yet unfinished, it cannot pass into circulation as a commodity. Secondly, since the working period necessary for the act of production lasts 3 months, and in actual fact simply forms a single interrelated labor process, every week a new dose of circulating capital must be added to the preceding one. The quantity of additional capital successively advanced thus grows with the length of the working period. We have assumed that equal capitals are invested in the spinning and machine-building businesses, that these capitals are divided equally into constant and variable capital, ditto into fixed and circulating capital, and that the working day is of the same length in each. In short, that all conditions are the same except for the duration of the working period. In the first week, the outlay is the same for both, but the product of the spinner can then be sold and new labor power, raw materials, etc. bought with the proceeds. In short, production can be continued on the same scale. The machine builder, on the other hand, can transform the circulating capital spent in the first week back into money and use it for a fresh operation only after 3 months, when his product has been completed. There is thus, firstly, a difference in the reflux of the same quantity of capital laid out. Secondly, however, the same amount of productive capital is applied both in the spinning mill and the machine factory over a 3-month period, but the amount of capital laid out is completely different for the spinner and the machine builder, since in the one case the same capital is quickly renewed and the same operation can thus be repeated afresh, while in the other case, the capital is renewed only relatively slowly and new amounts of capital must therefore be steadily added to the old until its renewal period arrives. Thus, the length of time in which specific portions of the capital are renewed, or the length of time during which capital is advanced, differs according to the length of the labor process, and so too does the amount of capital that has to be advanced, even though the capital applied daily or weekly is the same. This circumstance needs to be noted, for the time of advance can grow, as in the cases to be considered in the following chapter, without the amount of capital advanced growing in proportion to this length of time. The capital has to be advanced for longer, and a larger amount of capital is tied up in the form of productive capital. At the less developed stages of capitalist production, enterprises that require a long working period, and thus a large capital outlay for a longer time, particularly if they can be conducted only on a large scale, are often not pursued capitalistically at all. Roads, canals, etc., for example, were built at the cost of the municipality or the state, in earlier periods mostly by forced labor, insofar as labor power is concerned. Alternatively, products which require a long working period for their fabrication are manufactured only to a very minor extent with the financial means of the capitalist himself. In the construction of houses, for instance, the private individual for whom the house is being built pays advances to the builder in successive portions. He thus pays for the house bit by bit, in proportion to the progress of its production process. In the era of developed capitalism, however, where on the one hand massive capitals are concentrated in the hand of individuals, and on the other hand the associated capitalist, joint stock companies, steps onto the scene alongside the individual capitalist, where credit too is developed, it is only in exceptional cases that a capitalist builder still builds houses to order for individual clients. He makes a business out of building rows of houses in whole districts of towns for the market, just as individual capitalists make a business out of building railways as contractors. How capitalist production has revolutionized house building in London can be seen from this evidence given by a builder to the Bank Acts Committee of 1857. In his youth, he said, houses were generally built to order, and the price was paid to the contractor in installments as stages of the construction were completed. There was little speculative building. Contractors would resort to this principally just to keep their workers regularly occupied and hold their labor force together. In the last 40 years, all that has changed. There is now little building to order. If someone wants a new house, he looks for one that has already been built on speculation, or is already in the process of being built. Today, the contractor no longer works directly for a client, but rather for the market. Just like any other industrialist, he has to have finished goods for sale. Whereas previously, a contractor might have built 3 or 4 houses at a time on speculation, he now has to buy an extensive piece of land. In the continental sense, he leases it, usually for 99 years, erect on it up to 100 or 200 houses, and thus involve himself in an undertaking that exceeds his own means some 20 to 50 times over. Funds are procured by taking out a mortgage, and this money is put at the contractor's disposal bit by bit as the building of the house progresses. If a crisis breaks out, bringing the payment of these installments to a halt, then the whole undertaking generally collapses. In the best cases, the houses remain uncompleted until better times, while in the worst, they are auctioned off at half price. It is impossible nowadays for any contractor to get along without speculative building, and on a large scale at that. The profit on the actual construction is extremely slight. The main source of profit comes from raising the ground rent, and from the clever selection and exploitation of the building land. Almost the whole of Belgravia, Tyburnia, and the countless thousands of villas around London have been built in this way, by speculative anticipation of the demand for houses. Abbreviated from the report of the Select Committee on Bank Acts, Part 1, 1857. Large-scale jobs, needing particularly long working periods, are fully suitable for capitalist production only when the concentration of capital is already well advanced, and when the development of the credit system offers the capitalist the convenient expedient of advancing and thus risking other people's capital instead of his own. It is self-evident, however, that whether capital advanced for production belongs to the person who uses it or not has no effect on the speed and time of the turnover. Circumstances that increase the product of the individual working day, such as cooperation, division of labor, application of machinery, also shorten the working period for interconnected acts of production. Thus, machinery shortens the building time of houses, bridges, etc. Reaping and threshing machines, etc. shorten the working period required to transform ripened corn into a finished commodity. Improved shipbuilding techniques, resulting in greater speed, shorten the turnover time of the capital invested in shipping. These improvements, which shorten the working period and hence the time for which circulating capital has to be advanced, are generally bound up with an increased outlay of fixed capital. The working period, however, can be shortened in some branches simply by an extension of cooperation. The completion of a railway is hastened by setting afoot great armies of workers and tackling the job from many different points in space. Here, the turnover time is shortened by the growth of the capital advanced. More means of production and more labor power have to be united under the capitalist command. If the shortening of the working period is thus generally bound up with an increase in the capital advanced for this shorter time, so that the amount of capital advanced increases to the degree that the time of advance is shortened, we should remember that, apart from the total volume of social capital available, it comes down to a question of the extent to which the means of production and subsistence, i.e. disposal over them, are fragmented or united in the hands of individual capitalists, i.e. the extent reached by the concentration of capital. Insofar as credit mediates, accelerates, and intensifies the concentration of capital in a single hand, it contributes to shortening the working period, and with this also the turnover time. In branches of production where the working period, whether it is continuous or interrupted, is prescribed by specific natural conditions, no shortening can take place by the means described above. Quote, in regard to quicker returns, this term cannot be made to apply to corn crops, as one return only can be made per annum. In respect to stock, we will simply ask, how is the return of 2- and 3-year-old sheep and 4- and 5-year-old oxen to be quickened? End quote from W. Walter Good, Political, Agricultural, and Commercial Fallacies, published in London in 1866. The need to have ready cash as soon as possible, for example to pay fixed obligations such as taxes, ground rent, etc., solves this question insofar as cattle, for instance, are sold and slaughtered before they have reached the normal economic age, to the great detriment of agriculture. This also leads, moreover, to a rise in meat prices. Quote, men who have mainly reared cattle for supplying the pastures of the Midland counties in summer and the yards of the eastern counties in winter have become so crippled through the uncertainty and lowness in the prices of corn that they are glad to take advantage of the high prices of butter and cheese. The former they take to market weekly to help pay current expenses, and draw on the other from some factor who takes the cheese when fit to move and, of course, nearly at his own price. For this reason, remembering that farming is governed by the principles of political economy, the calves which used to come south from the dairying counties for rearing are now largely sacrificed, at times at a week and 10 days old in the shambles of Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, and other large neighboring towns. If, however, malt had been free from duty, not only would farmers have made more profit and therefore been able to keep their stock till it got older and heavier, but it would have been substituted for milk and rearing by men who did not keep the cows, and thus the present alarming scarcity of young cattle which has befallen the nation would have been largely averted. What these little men now say, in reply to recommendations to rear, is, we know very well it would pay to rear on milk, but it would first require us to put our hands in our purse, which we cannot do, and then we should have to wait a long time for a return, instead of getting it at once by dairying. End quote. If the lengthening of turnover can have consequences like this, even among the smaller English farmers, it is easy to understand what disturbances it must provoke among the small peasants of the continent. According to the duration of the working period, and thus also the period till a commodity ready for circulation is completed, the portion of value that the fixed capital surrenders layer by layer to the product mounts up, and the reflux of this portion of value is delayed. This delay, however, does not necessitate a renewed outlay of fixed capital. The machine continues to operate in the production process whether replacement for its wear and tear flows back quicker or more slowly in the money form. It is different with circulating capital. Here, not only must capital be tied up for a longer time, in proportion to the duration of the labor process, but new capital must continually be advanced for wages, raw and ancillary materials. The delayed reflux thus has a different effect in the two cases. Whether the reflux is slower or quicker, the fixed capital continues to operate. The circulating capital, on the contrary, becomes unable to function when reflux is delayed, if it is tied up in the form of unsold or unfinished and not yet saleable products, and there is no additional capital to renew it in kind. Quote, while the peasant farmer starves, his cattle thrive. Repeated showers had fallen in the country, and the forage was abundant. The Hindu peasant will perish by hunger beside a fat bullock. The prescriptions of superstition, which appear cruel to the individual, are conservative for the community, and the preservation of the laboring cattle secures the power of cultivation and the sources of future life and wealth. It may sound harsh and sad to say so, but in India, it is more easy to replace a man than an ox. End quote from Return, East India, Madras and Orissa famine. We can compare this with a passage from the Manava Dharma Sastra. Quote, desertion of life, without reward, for the sake of preserving a priest or a cow, may cause the beatitude of those base-born tribes. It is impossible, of course, to deliver a 5-year-old animal before the end of 5 years. But what is possible within certain limits is to prepare animals for their fate more quickly by new modes of treatment. This was precisely what Bakewell managed to do. Previously, British sheep, just like French sheep as late as 1855, were not ready for slaughter before the 4th or 5th year. In Bakewell's system, 1-year-old sheep can already be fattened, and in any case they are fully grown before the 2nd year has elapsed. By careful selective breeding, Bakewell, farmer of Dishley Grange, reduced the bone structure of his sheep to the minimum necessary for their existence. These sheep are called the new Leicesters. Quote, the breeder can now send 3 to market in the same space of time that it formerly took him to prepare 1, and if they are not taller, they are broader, rounder, and have a greater development in those parts which give the most flesh. Of bone, they have absolutely no greater amount than is necessary to support them, and almost all their weight is pure meat. End quote from Laverne, The Rural Economy of England, etc., 1855. The methods that shorten the working period differ greatly in the extent to which they can be applied in different branches of industry, and they do not cancel out the differences in length of the different working periods. To stick to our example, the application of new machine tools may, in absolute terms, shorten the working period necessary for the production of a locomotive. But if improved processes in spinning increase the finished product turned out daily or weekly here to an even greater extent, then the length of the working period in machine building will still have increased relatively compared with that in spinning.